So with that, let's get started. Leading our webinar today is Dr. Lisa McCoo. Dr. McCoo is the Director of Program Implementation at Aperture Education and comes to us today with a wealth of experience from several different roles within the education space, such as a school psychologist, division-wide SEL specialist, adjunct associate professor, and the SEL for Virginia leadership team member. Lisa, welcome.
Thanks, Laura. I really appreciate being here, and I appreciate seeing everybody in the chat. I'm hoping that you guys have had a chance to introduce yourselves in the chat so that you can see who's here with you. We are going to be using the chat to engage with each other, and so it would really be nice to see where you guys are coming from throughout Illinois. But let's go ahead and get started with our program today. So, the well-being of our students has always been at the forefront for educators and educational leaders. However, it has taken on much greater significance over the last several years, and states like Illinois are rightfully prioritizing how they support the overall well-being of students under their care. But that doesn't mean that we know where to start, and sometimes that can be the scariest part. So today we're going to focus on what leaders in the field tell us about best practices so that we can minimize those apprehensions and feel confident in creating plans that are going to move us all forward for student well-being. So our goals during this webinar are to review the national and state landscape, to explore universal screenings as part of a comprehensive approach to student well-being, and to learn how to implement universal screenings efficiently and empathetically. Throughout our time today, I'm going to be asking you to engage in reflection and response, and at times, again, putting your ideas in the chat so that you can hear from each other and we can all learn together. So let's get started. So looking back over the last couple of years, if you only based your knowledge of the pandemic impact on what you read in the headlines, things are pretty dire. There is no shortage of information about how the pandemic has negatively impacted student well-being. And of course, without a doubt, things are hard. However, if you had to write your own headline about the post-pandemic well-being of your educators and your students, what would it say? Take a moment and think. And if you're comfortable, put your headline in the chat so that others can see. And I'll just give you a couple seconds to respond. So while you guys are thinking about that headline, let's keep looking at the landscape across our nation. So according to prevalence data released in 2022 from the Centers for Disease Control, among children and adolescents aged 12 to 17 years, 1/5 reported having experienced at least some kind of major depressive episode. Although the pandemic did not help matters, it also did not cause what we are seeing. This was not a new post-pandemic phenomenon. The CDC data you see on the screen is from 2009 to 2019, 10 years prior to the pandemic, which showed that high school students were demonstrating an increase in poor mental health outcomes. Looking more closely on the impact of the pandemic, the CDC found that more than 1/3 of high school students reported they experienced poor mental health during the pandemic, and 44% reported that they persistently felt sad or hopeless during that past year. And unfortunately, almost 20% had seriously considered attempting suicide. But again, this is not a new phenomenon. The pandemic just shined a light on what was already happening. So, how did Illinois answer the call? Well, seeing the need rise in Illinois, among other things, a 2021 task force led by the Illinois State Board of Education was tasked to develop age-appropriate emotional intelligence and social-emotional curriculum and assessment guidelines and best practices for schools. Among the recommendations was the prioritization of universal screening as a proactive approach to identify needs to inform instruction and supports at all tiers, but especially for students who need more. The idea was to provide routine data to inform decisions within a system aiming to improve mental wellness, to prevent social emotional behavior problems, and to ensure all students have access to a continuum of supports to ensure help is provided before little problems become big ones. This was bolstered by Title 77, Part 664, which included social, emotional, and developmental screening as part of the school physical and health examination requirement for all students. And in June of 2022, Illinois enacted the Wellness Checks in Schools Programs Act for schools wishing to engage in wellness checks of their middle and high schoolers to identify students at risk for mental health conditions. In March 2022, Illinois' governor launched the Illinois Children's Behavioral Health Transformation Initiative in collaboration with the University of Chicago to evaluate and redesign the delivery of behavioral health services for children and adolescents in Illinois. Among many recommendations, one of the most important was to intervene earlier and to be more proactive by including universal screening and education. Among other follow-up activities, a landscape analysis was conducted to identify what was happening already to support students' mental well-being. And the landscape analysis found that about 27% of Illinois districts were already engaged in universal screening to support the mental well-being of their students. But frequency of administration and implementation generally varied by size of district, by geography, with urban districts tending to engage in universal screening more than rural districts. And although the tools used varied, and some districts noted that they used more than one tool, the DESA, or the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, which is the only research-based and psychometrically sound screener focused solely on students' resiliency skills and strengths, was one of the most common screening tools being used. But why is all this information important to you now? Well, the blueprint recommended a phased approach to continue to push the work forward. Therefore, starting in the 24-25 school year, the Wellness Checks in Schools Programs Act will be strongly recommended for all Illinois schools. During today's webinar, I'll show you how those using the DESA either alone or in conjunction with risk-based assessments will be ahead of the game and how they support students. Now, this is a phenomenal start, setting in motion a legislative effort to prioritize the promotion of positive mental health for Illinois students, and it beautifully aligns with best practices from the National Center for Student Mental Health. For school mental health. But the tricky part is really not the desire to support students, but simply getting started and connecting next steps to things you're already doing. So let's break this down by chunks. So our first hurdle for many districts is simply taking stock and determining needs for layering on protective pieces to support the social, emotional, behavioral well-being of students. The goal is to have universal supports that are effectively meeting the basic safety and psychological needs of at least 80% of students, and then providing the environment to support the success of students who require targeted or intensive support as they learn and practice new skills that will build their resilience. And we do that through universal practices that attend to the environment, creating predictable and consistent routines and procedures, by establishing school-wide expectations, co-creating norms with students about how we agree to be with each other. Within a safe environment, students are more likely to learn, to engage, and to continue to develop their social and emotional skills. We also set that strong universal foundation by intentionally building relationships to foster a sense of community and connectedness as well as establish strong support networks for both kids and adults. And finally, there has to be an intentional focus on building social emotional skills to foster protective factors and resiliency. This typically occurs through explicit social emotional instruction, intentional practice of skills, and generalization of skills between school and home. And focusing on these universal components helps to create a trauma-sensitive foundation of prevention and proactive response to meet the psychological needs that we all have. Resilience doesn't just come from individuals alone. It is shaped by the environments that we create. Now, traditionally, we have focused on mental health and well-being from the perspective of an absence of risk indicators. However, an absence of risk does not equate to or guarantee the presence of social emotional skills and assets. So when we focus on building skills that will foster resilience, this not only creates protective factors in students, but also positively impacts all those other best practices that we use in education. It benefits students' ability to follow school-wide expectations through PBIS, to repair harm when it occurs through restorative practices, and to help students be present and fully engage with instruction. Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, is quoted as saying, "I believe psychology has done very well in working out how to understand and treat disease. But I think that is literally half-baked. If all you do is work to fix problems, to alleviate suffering, then by definition, you are working to get people to zero, to neutral. When we react to student issues that rise to the surface, such as just waiting for a student to indicate on a survey that they're in a state of crisis, but we don't dig deeper to identify what skills they need to better handle that situation the next time, this is oftentimes what we end up doing. In order to change course, we have to become more proactive in identifying what pro-social skills students are demonstrating and what skills need to be strengthened to prevent kids from relying on unproductive and unhealthy responses that not only get them into trouble, but can lead to poor mental health outcomes. And we need to do that from a strengths-based lens. Now, while both a strengths-based and a risk-based approach serve to support the mental health and well-being of students, each approach on its own is quite different. A strength-based approach focuses on building awareness of student strengths or protective factors, which they may never have ever thought about before. This gives them confidence that they have skills, which will empower them to navigate through those challenging moments. It also allows us as adults to more productively partner with students and reinforce the power of yet. It allows us to get ahead of difficulties that students may be having and proactively build skills that they will absolutely need when the time comes. A risk-based approach is one that allows students to use their own voice to self-identify the feelings that they are feeling, which may not always be overtly observable by others. And even though it gives us an indicator of who need help, it is a reactive approach based on waiting for things to rise to an elevated level before we respond. Additionally, when you assess from a risk or deficit-based lens, this does require an immediate follow-up. And given that the emotional state of teenagers is often in flux, there will be instances where you will see false positives, which can tax your already strained system, focusing on students who are not necessarily in crisis, but do need to build their social-emotional skill sets so that they can manage those strong emotions. So using one approach in isolation without the other can paint an incomplete picture when talking about comprehensive mental well-being. We can miss helping students see the connection between their strengths and how they can use them to protect against mental health challenges. We might overlook some students who are in distress unless they are intentionally taught to self-advocate and there are well-established supports in place for them to use. And finally, we may miss the opportunity to simply start from a place of strength, growth, and resilience. By identifying and building social emotional assets alongside our knowledge of who is at risk, we increase our ability to effectively take action and streamline our efforts to bolster protective factors in students so that they can use their skills in all contexts. So based on the research, promoting student well-being is best done through a dual model resilience and risk framework that focuses on developing strengths or protective factors to promote resilience and early identification and prevention of risk factors. This framework prioritizes all of the components of a trauma-sensitive approach as recommended by SAMHSA and aligns with guidance from the University of Maryland National Center for School Mental Health. Students who have well-developed protective factors are better positioned to navigate challenges and to mitigate and respond to risk factors. Our next webinar, that will be in a couple weeks, I think, will dive more deeply into this framework to give you a better picture of complete well-being. Now, making sure you have a clear vision of the framework that your district will follow for this phased approach will serve you well as you move forward in your decision-making about next steps. But regardless of the framework that you choose, though, in alignment with the blueprint, a comprehensive approach will include universal screening for your students so that we have a reliable and valid way to identify students' strengths and have an early indicator of risk. But what do we mean by universal screening? Well, according to the University of Maryland Center for School Mental Health, universal screening is the assessment of students to determine whether they may be at risk for concerns regarding their well-being. Screening can be conducted broadly or with defined populations, such as certain grade levels. But it's broad on purpose, trying to catch as many individuals as possible who may be at risk. Screening is simply designed to identify risk factors so we can act quickly and effectively using reliable data. It shifts the focus from a reactive wait to fail model to a proactive system where needs are identified early and interventions are delivered efficiently and effectively. When done well, there are several benefits of universal screening. First, it allows for that early identification of risk, which can then inform a more systematic proactive approach to universal and advanced tiered supports and programming, following a public health model of support. And second, having that data then allows us to intentionally monitor the strengths and needs of students over time. Finally, using universal screening proactively is considerably more cost-effective compared to a reactive approach that tends to lead to more long-term or highly intensive supports. The challenges that many districts experience that prevent them from getting started with universal screening are simply, number one, not knowing what reliable and valid measures are available. Number two, budget limitations. And number three, limited resources and supports for following up, among other legal, logistical, community issues. Districts simply need guidance, and I applaud you all for taking that step to learn more today. So let's take stock to see how many of you are already engaging in universal screening. So you should see on your screen a poll that asks you, how are you implementing social, emotional, and behavioral screening? We'll just give it just a second while everybody responds. Pardon me, sorry about that. Looks like we have almost everyone participated. Give it a few more seconds. All right, I think perfect. All right, looks like we have a little bit of variability, which really honestly matches the blueprint, the landscape analysis. So we have about 40% who are already engaging in some sort of universal screening, and that's awesome. And we have some people who are engaging in some partial screening, currently looking, or not really screening yet. So this is really a beautiful picture of really what the landscape analysis showed us. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. So many times, even though districts may not be using universal screenings, and some of you are using them only partially or maybe not at all, but districts are most likely using data points to monitor the mental well-being of students. So let's take a little bit of a data detour to look at what the research tells us in terms of outcomes for social and emotional success. You are hopefully well familiar with the 2011 Durlak et al. Meta-analysis of the impact of social-emotional learning that found that K-12 students receiving universal social-emotional programming, including explicit social-emotional instruction, integrated opportunities to practice those skills throughout the school day, and generalization of those skills across all settings, demonstrated significant growth in social-emotional competence, improved attitudes about themselves and school, significant decreases in negative behaviors and emotional distress, and increased academic performance. In March of this year, the Learning Policy Institute just published an updated brief outlining the results of several meta-analyses looking at the evidence base for high-quality social-emotional programming from studies from around the globe. And Cipriano et al. Were able to replicate Durlak's original findings and looked at some long-term outcomes. And what they found was reassuringly similar and familiar. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Having better social-emotional skills allows students to use those skills to create strong, positive relationships that build support networks. And when I have positive pro-social skills, then I'm better able to apply those skills in challenging situations, reducing my likelihood of using less productive and unhealthy responses that can get me into trouble or can negatively impact my mental well-being. Having positive pro-social skills builds my self-efficacy or the belief in my skills and my self-esteem, creating a resiliency effect the next time I come upon a challenge. So, based on the research evidence, there are several possible sources of data to indicate positive social, emotional, and behavioral well-being, such as measuring social-emotional competence, behaviors, emotional well-being checks, engagement, academic performance. So let's take a moment to brainstorm data sources that are available to you in your district that might fall under these categories. And as you're brainstorming, I want you to also identify which of those sources are risk-based and which are strength-based. And I'm going to set my timer for about 30 seconds. Just give you time to think. All right. So hopefully you thought about several data points that maybe fall under each of these categories. So let's take a look at some common sources of data that we oftentimes include in our examination of student social, emotional, and behavioral success. And let's reflect on the type of data it gives and what questions you can answer. So we'll start with surveys. Surveys like school climate surveys measure perceptions, feelings, opinions. It's an efficient way to elicit stakeholder feedback. You typically get a rating on what's called a Likert scale, like a 1 to 4 rating. So for example, 60% of my students indicate that they only sometimes feel safe at school. But what does that mean? Does that mean more kids are being bullied and they don't have the skill to speak up? Does that mean we don't have a system for them to speak up? Does that mean that students don't know how to effectively make connections with other kids so they feel alone and unsafe? Now, because this is oftentimes a non-standardized type of assessment, it oftentimes does not have strong evidence of reliability and validity. With that data, though, I can determine if there is a general need but not necessarily where the need is or why it's happening, that root cause. Perceptions, feelings, and opinions are often an outcome indicator of other things, such as skill development. If you give surveys more than once, you can determine if there is improvement in data, but not necessarily if that improvement is meaningful, making it challenging to use this data for high-stakes decisions like allocation of resources. And similarly, behavior referral data provides us with information about the presence or absence of negative behaviors that can lead to unhealthy mental health outcomes. But it's just a raw score count. We can use it to generally tell us if there is a need and if there's general improvement. But behavior referral data is also an outcome indicator of other things, such as skill development. With a standardized norm reference rating scale, such as the DESA, you are able to obtain a reliable and valid assessment of student positive, pro-social, and resiliency skills. Having a standard score like a T-score provides meaning and context to data we have, because this type of data is interpreted based on a normal curve, or what many know as the bell curve. This gives us information on what a typical score is and how far from typical do we need to be in order for it to be significant and meaningful. Therefore, we can use it to determine whether there's a need universally, where that need is for early intervention, if there's improvement, whether that improvement is significant and meaningful, and what the rate of improvement is, which allows us to measure impact of programming and determination of actionable next steps. But the trend is that student skills can be a contributing factor to the mental health outcomes that we see. So why don't we cut to the chase and see if we can universally support students in building their skills using sound assessment and research-based supports. I want to take a little bit of another step back and highlight a very specific psychometric detail about the DESA. Because as we just saw, not all data is created equally. We can ask kids about their self-perceptions and how they feel they are doing. We can also ask them how often they feel sad or depressed, or any number of other risk-based data points. But the best way to identify whether kids are using positive skills is to build their resilience, is to observe whether kids are using positive skills to build their resilience. In 60 seconds or less, DESA mini data can predict whether a student needs more, and that's before they ever receive their first office referral. Peer-reviewed studies have found that students identified in the need for instruction range by the DESA mini at the beginning of the year are 450% more likely to be suspended or expelled by the end of the school year. Having strong data helps educators implement true proactive support instead of waiting until a student is referred for problem solving or for special education or needing a threat assessment. Another exciting update is that our research and development team has conducted updated norming. So for the 24-25 school year, you will be looking at updated post-pandemic norms, which will be crucial in how you are supporting students. So now let's dive into what best practice recommendations looks like to create a comprehensive picture of supporting student mental well-being. Best practice recommendations to support a comprehensive approach are readily available through the National Center for School Mental Health out of the University of Maryland. And that guidance aligns nicely to Illinois' blueprint and legislation. But the hardest part of any new venture is just making sure we're all on the same page, we all know where we're going, and we all know when we will arrive. Based on the work that you've already done to set a foundation for strong mental well-being for your students, make sure to bring your stakeholders into the conversation so that they understand what's already been done and to create a path moving forward. Setting clear goals and action steps with the input from all stakeholders that align with current legislation creates transparency and trust. Without those two things, engaging in any initiative for well-being may be an uphill battle. Next, we should take stock of existing risk-based data that you may already have in place, which you may have jotted down just a few minutes ago. Having something of an early warning system within your MTSS framework based on readily available data is a great start. This is also a great way to avoid duplication of efforts to preserve financial resources. We oftentimes have plenty of data in districts that measure risk: attendance, grades, nurse visits, behavior referrals, suspensions. But what many districts lack is step 3, a way to reliably and universally screen to determine whether they are in fact building students' social-emotional skill strengths or those protective factors. Starting with strengths is crucial to building partnerships with your students and families. Strengths-based measures tend to be more palatable to families. They minimize bias because we're asking educators and students to focus on what they are doing well. And finally, it helps us to authentically partner with students and their families to increase student ownership over their learning, thus increasing student engagement. But I implore you to do your homework. Know what's available and the research available for the tool that you choose. Now, in just a few moments, I'm going to show you how the DESA can support your comprehensive universal screening approach. However, lastly, to close the loop on a comprehensive approach to universal screening, you may want to consider incorporating a specific mental health risk-based screener to ensure that you are catching all students and that no one is falling through the cracks. But this last step can be challenging if you have not done the steps before. So let's take another look at how everyone is experiencing this. So based on your reflections so far, how confident are you that you could reliably identify positive skills that students have or need to build resilience? See a lot of people responding, a lot of people thinking. Thank you so much for those who have already responded. We'll give people just a few more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. Let's see how we did. All right, are we sharing the results? Let's see. There we go. So based on your reflections so far, we have about 83% of you being somewhat confident. We have 17% being very confident. This is a really great start. And that's really what it's about, is really making sure that we have the ability to know what skills students have and where we need to build those skills, to build that resilience in students. So thank you so much for that. So once you've laid the foundation for this work, the next challenge is making sure you have all your ducks in a row. You need to know exactly what you plan to do, for whom, who's going to lead the effort, and how are you going to follow up. The devil really is in the details. One of the biggest pieces to this puzzle is figuring out who to screen. Now, although you eventually want to screen everyone, it will be recommended to at least focus on your 7th through 12th graders to align with the current guidance. This will, however, allow you to test processes and procedures, to refine and then scale to all students. But how we prepare staff for these next steps is going to be an important part of your success. If staff will be completing the screeners, they'll want to know all the ins and outs, like when, during the instructional day, will they screen students? How will they access resources? What is the communication plan for families, since the teacher is typically a family's first point of contact? What's the plan for building staff knowledge of well-being and how screening data supports that? And finally, what's the plan for analyzing data and next steps for follow-up? Who's going to analyze the data? How will those team members build their data literacy? How often will data be analyzed and through what structure? What strategies and resources do we have internally to follow up with students? If we need to utilize community partnerships for follow-up, what does that referral process look like? So think a moment about all those questions that we're going to need to answer. Success will not be based on checking a box, but will be based on how intentionally we plan. There are real people behind this work who need support, just like our students do. Sometimes the easiest way to think about logistical planning is to reflect on past successes. So think about other initiatives that your district has implemented. What components were successful in that implementation and why? What got in the way? Jot down some ideas, maybe on your own, or if you feel comfortable, put them in the chat. I'll just give you a few seconds to respond. So while you're thinking and while you're jotting down those ideas, let's take a look at some actionable next steps. To ensure your successful planning, here's some things you might want to consider. An effective way to implement any new initiative is to start small and scale, using a PDSA cycle to engage in rapid cycles of improvement. This will give you time to test out processes and ensure that they work well prior to implementing district-wide. I've linked in a resource from Connors et al. To show you how you can use PDSA cycles to support screening and well-being in schools. I've also given you a PDSA template that you can use to support your work. You'll want to also build in purposeful time to train and prepare staff to build their confidence in the process. An effective training answers all those relevant questions: the what, why, who, when, where, how. This will be your opportunity to paint a good picture of the system that you are building for screening and follow-up. Helping staff feel confident, building their knowledge about well-being generally, and what signs of trouble look like in students through PD, like mental health first aid training, will empower your educators and their skill sets to know how to support students. Getting their input about what the screening process will most effectively look like through those PDSA cycles will build trust and buy-in. And finally, engage in resource mapping so you know what resources exist for follow-up at each tier of your MTSS framework. This will help to close the loop and ensure effective follow-up. The goal, again, will be to have effective universal programming and supports in place to minimize the number of students who need support at those advanced tiers. But this may take some reflection and refinement. And don't be afraid to continuously improve. The National Center for School Mental Health has some great resources and examples on their site of how you might go about this resource mapping. And then second, complete a projection table based on known MTSS percentages. Once you have an estimate of the number of students who may need additional support, you can then start to see how supports might have to look at advanced tiers to meet the anticipated need. This can inform entrance and exit criteria for Tier 2 supports, and when you might need to seek community partnership support. Our last piece to this puzzle is following through. Once we've put the system in place, we need to plan time to reflect, to refine, to improve. We have to evaluate processes and outcomes. Did your resource mapping and projections adequately anticipate the number of students you ended up serving? For students who needed more, were you able to provide that support? Did your mental health staff have the bandwidth you anticipated? Did staff, students, and families feel knowledgeable and supported throughout the process? Did we communicate results to stakeholders to show that we did what we said we would do? We've talked a lot about best practices, but now I want to give you a very brief example of what this might look like using DESA data for universal screening to make efficient and effective decisions about student support. So, as a reminder, here is our best practice process. We start with that vision, we engage in universal screening, identify support, then implement that support, and then we monitor, we celebrate, we improve. Okay, so let me paint a picture for you. So after conducting, let's say, focus group conversations with relevant stakeholders, schools in our districts now have a unified vision connected to our strategic goals and a clear framework for student well-being, focused first on strengths, but incorporating a resilience and risk framework. So now we engage in universal strength-based screening using Aperture's DESA, or Deborah Student Strength Assessment. And our high school MTSS team reviews the data, which shows that we have about 12% of students needing more support, since the students are not yet demonstrating their positive pro-social skills very often. But this is actually great news because it is lower than we anticipated. Additional risk-based screening data, along with other early warning system data points, helps us to identify a few more students and allows us to triangulate both strength-based and risk-based data to confirm who may need support, and we're still within our anticipated bandwidth. When drilling down into what supports students need on the DESA, we were able to determine that students had the greatest need in self-awareness and optimistic thinking, which aligned with our risk-based screener data, gave us a concrete place to start in how we supported student skill building to foster resilience. So we will begin to incorporate universal strategies from our strength-based programming during advisory to support this competency, while we begin to plan for student support at advanced tiers. This was a great beginning because we were able to catch students early through our proactive screening and early warning system. So we've identified students for follow-up. We've planned out needed groups based on identified areas of strength and areas for growth. Now we'll share results with families along with desired next steps for small group support on screening results. We elicit parent consent to implement next steps. Our student support staff meet with students, focusing on observations of students' strengths, plus skills the student is not yet using often, and invite students to join a small group that is forming to specifically build those skills. Student assents, but maybe also ask if it's possible to meet with someone individually. Through a planned referral process, knowing our staffing limits, we refer the student to any partner or community mental health organizations who can support. Small groups maybe meet weekly or biweekly, focusing on social-emotional skills to foster protective factors, using lessons from the DESA Aperture system, which is aligned to our screening data. 8 weeks later, we do another follow-up DESA assessment, since it can be used for both screening and progress monitoring, to see the impact of our work, and we can see concrete growth in student skills. This is a celebration. Based on student feedback, students feel supported. They know who they can go to for support and how to access that support. Students have made connections with their small groups, expanding their support networks. And maybe the students are observed eating lunch together. And finally, teachers have observed that students are more readily asking for help in class, demonstrating generalization of skills. So our next steps are to prioritize a next set of skills to reinforce throughout our MTSS framework. Triangulate this celebratory data with other key data points and communicate overall growth back out to our community. Maybe at the next school board meeting, we can share out growth we've seen overall in student social-emotional skills that foster resilience, alongside possibly reductions in numbers of students flagged on our risk-based screener for using one, and reductions in data such as threat assessments. And we can be confident that the trust that we built with the community is being honored, and we are achieving our strategic goals and helping students thrive. Now, this is just an example, but hopefully you can start picturing how this might look in your district. And maybe you're getting a little excited. So let us end our time by highlighting how the DESA Aperture system can support Illinois districts for comprehensive student well-being. So throughout our time today, we've reviewed the national and state landscape. We've unpacked some new guidance slated for the 24-25 school year. And we've broken down how universal screening using the DESA can be implemented as part of your comprehensive approach to student mental well-being in Illinois. So now it's your turn. Take a moment and think. In reflecting on all you learned today, what is your first next step? Just think. And if you feel comfortable, feel free to put something in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds to respond.
Right, thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you for all your time today. We don't have any outstanding questions, but don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am your Illinois DESA advisor, and I'm happy to help you learn more about how the DESA whole child system of support can support your district. We also look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in a couple of weeks. This session will dive more deeply into the resilience and risk model for meeting the mental well-being of students. So stay tuned for an email invitation for this.
And
we hope
Laura,
you had a great, yep.
Actually, one question just popped up in the Q&A.
Oh, perfect. Is there more information as to how the DESA aligns with second step? Yes, the second step competencies will be what you see in the DESA reports. So those units, there's 4 different competencies on the DESA second step assessments, and that's reflected in your data when you get your results. So we're happy to show you more about that. If you have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me and I can show you a demo of what that looks like in the platform. Any more questions?
I don't see any more, but let's see if we can look at the chat a little bit. Let's see. So Sandy put a question in the chat. I do have a question about the percentage of students who take the DESA and the possibility of skewed responses. So it's an interesting question. So the DESA is based on very reliable and sound psychometric properties. However, it is based on a self-assessment, and there is some error, standard error of measurement in any sort of assessment that we give. However, when someone assesses themselves on how often that they're using a skill, we have to take that as that baseline and then start from there. So there may be opportunities. I know for instance, for my own high schoolers that I have as my own children, I know that sometimes when you ask them how often that they do something, they are legitimately, reliably telling you how often they are self-assessing. And again, it's based on that norm reference data. So you're comparing that to that norm population. But sometimes kids don't recognize those skills in others. And that's why it's very, very important to start from that strengths-based lens, because they need to know that those skills that they're using are their social emotional strengths, so they can recognize them when they do demonstrate them.
Another question, how often do you screen the students? A typical implementation, we screen 3 times a year. So that would be in the fall, winter, and spring, but you do have some flexibility in how you want to set that up.
And I see a lot of great responses in the chat, a lot of good headlines that people put in, a lot of really great considerations, thinking about time, resources, educator demands. Looking to see. Sandy had another follow-up question. Let's see. What are people doing with data collected in spring since school year is ending? Do you want to take that one, Lori? Or do you want me to take that one?
You can take that one. I'll take some of these next ones.
Okay, so a lot of times what people end up doing with that spring data is, number one, they use it to measure program impact. So they compare it to their previous ratings throughout the school year to see how impactful their programming was that they supported students with. But then they also use that to plan for the next year. So really to really get ahead of supports for students. So maybe they start the ground running in the fall with some supports in place, and then do another baseline, get ready for that fall baseline once they've put some supports in place. So that's a lot of times how people end up using the DESA data for measuring program impact and then turning around and using it for planning for the fall. Another way that people use that data, besides using it for program impact, is to be able to communicate out progress to the community. So sometimes we end up engaging with our school board to let them know the impact that our programming is having, so that we can also use it to see if we need more resources. I know some districts have used DESA data as a way to make a case for needing more personnel, needing more materials, needing more resources. So those are a few ways that people have used that information.
There was a question about testing in the fall. I don't see it here anymore, but I can address it quickly. Typically, we wait about 4 weeks into the semester before testing, so teachers have the opportunity to observe those behaviors. So,
Did you answer the question about the K-12 teachers in K-12 completing the screener is acceptable to push back?
nope, I'm just reading through that now.
Okay.
You can certainly push it back to any time in the year. You set up those testing windows at the beginning of the year in your planning session. Obviously, we want to make sure we get that baseline as soon as possible, because that's really important to measure progress and plan implementation programs.
And I will say that the guidance, if you read the DESA manual, the guidance is to give it about 4 weeks for teacher, and that gives teachers time to get to know their students. It gives teachers time to observe their students in multiple contexts, to see them in whole group instruction, in partner work, in individual stations, in the hallway, playground, classroom, like all different context. We want to give several weeks of observational time before you do that first baseline, so that teachers feel confident when they rate their students that they've seen them in multiple contexts.
Thank you. Well, we're happy to answer additional questions. If they come up, feel free to reach out to us directly. Can they be used on a smaller scale? As far as not universally, yes, you can use it in specific classrooms, or I think Lisa mentioned specific grades. Any group of students that you want, you can screen for the DESA. But in order to capture, those students that are at risk, we want to make sure that we're casting that net as wide as possible. The DESA is not free. It's a system through Aperture Education. We're happy to talk more about what that will look like in your district as well.
And there are several different ways that districts fund using a universal screening tool like the DESA. There are a lot of ways to look at that funding, and so we're happy to talk through those options with you.
Well, thank you again, everyone. We hope you have a great rest of the week and look forward to learning with you again soon. Take care.